Ethan Carter had always imagined that moving into his dream house would be the start of a peaceful chapter in his life. Nestled in the picturesque suburbs of Denver, Colorado, the house was perfect, spacious, surrounded by lush greenery, and far enough from the city to avoid rush-hour chaos but close enough for a quick commute. It was everything he'd hoped for. What he didn't anticipate, however, was that his new neighbors weren't just regular folks, they were members of an HOA, Homeowners Association, a group so bureaucratic it made the DMV look like Disneyland. The trouble began on a sunny Tuesday morning. Ethan was sipping his coffee on the porch, admiring the view, when a man in khakis and a polo shirt approached him with the kind of self-importance usually reserved for reality TV stars. The man introduced himself as Richard, the president of the HOA. Ethan barely had time to say hello before Richard handed him an envelope with a grim expression that suggested Ethan had committed a crime against humanity. "Mr. Carter," Richard began, "we've noticed several violations on your property that contravene our HOA regulations." Ethan blinked. Violations? He hadn't even unpacked all his boxes yet. "I'm sorry, violations? Could you be more specific?" Richard sighed deeply, as if explaining basic concepts to a toddler. "Your front door is painted blue." Ethan stared at him, waiting for further explanation. When none came, he asked, And Richard said with the exasperation of someone explaining why gravity exists, "Blue is not an approved color in our community. The HOA guidelines clearly state that all front doors must be painted either beige or eggshell white." Ethan couldn't help but laugh. "You're joking, right?" Richard's face remained as serious as a tax audit. "I assure you, Mr. Carter, this is no laughing matter. That was just the beginning." Over the next week, Ethan received more notices from the HOA than he'd received Christmas cards in his entire life. Apparently, his mailbox was 2 inches too tall, his lawn had unauthorized flora, a single sunflower planted by the previous owner, and his trash cans weren't brought in within the HOA-mandated window of 2 hours after pickup. Ethan tried to reason with them. He attended an HOA meeting armed with logic and common sense, thinking surely these people would see how absurd their rules were. But he quickly realized that logic had no place in this Kafkaesque nightmare. The meeting resembled a cult gathering more than a community discussion. Richard presided over it like a medieval king, and every suggestion Ethan made was met with gasps of horror from the other members. "We can't make exceptions," one woman whispered as though Ethan had proposed sacrificing puppies. "If we let you keep your sunflower, what's next? Palm trees?" Ethan left the meeting feeling like he'd wandered into an alternate universe where petty tyranny reigned supreme. But things escalated when he received another letter from Richard, this time threatening legal action if Ethan didn't comply with their demands. Legal action? Ethan muttered to himself as he read the letter over breakfast. For what? Crimes against beige? The letter claimed that if Ethan didn't repaint his door and remove the sunflower within 7 days, the HOA would begin proceedings to seize ownership of his property under some obscure clause buried deep in their covenants, conditions, and restrictions. CC and RS. Ethan couldn't believe it. These people were actually trying to claim his house over a sunflower and a blue door. Now, here's what Richard and his merry band of bureaucrats didn't know. Ethan wasn't just any homeowner. He was a federal judge, a man who spent his days untangling legal disputes far more complex than HOA nonsense. If there was one thing Ethan knew better than anyone else, it was how to navigate legal documents, and he suspected these CC and RS were riddled with loopholes. Ethan decided it was time to fight fire with fire, or rather, paperwork with paperwork. He spent hours combing through every line of the HOA's governing documents, highlighting inconsistencies and outright illegalities. For example, their threat to seize his property violated state laws governing HOAs, their fines exceeded reasonable limits, and their rule about door colors wasn't even properly ratified. But Ethan didn't stop there. He began documenting every interaction with Richard and the HOA board, every email, every notice, every passive-aggressive comment about his sunflower, and compiled it into what could only be described as the encyclopedia of petty tyranny. By the end of the week, he had enough evidence to make even seasoned lawyers weep. When Richard showed up at Ethan's house again, this time accompanied by 2 other board members, Ethan greeted them with a smile that could only be described as predatory. "Mr. Carter," Richard began pompously, "we're here to discuss your repeated violations." "Oh good," Ethan said cheerfully. "I've been meaning to discuss your violations too." Richard frowned in confusion as Ethan handed him a thick binder labeled HOA Misconduct, Volume 1. "What is this?" Richard asked suspiciously. "It's documentation," Ethan replied innocently. You see, I've been reviewing your CC and RS and noticed several issues, like how your threat to seize my property violates Colorado Revised Statutes Section 38-33.3-3021K. Oh, and did you know your fines exceed limits established by state law? Fascinating stuff. Richard's face turned redder than a stop sign as he flipped through page after page of damning evidence. I don't think, he stammered. Oh, Ethan interrupted smoothly, and one more thing. I filed complaints with both the state HOA oversight agency and my colleagues at the federal courthouse. The other board members looked like they wanted to disappear into thin air. By the end of their visit, Richard left without saying another word, and Ethan couldn't help but feel victorious as he watched them retreat down his driveway like defeated soldiers. That evening, Ethan sat on his porch sipping whiskey and admiring his sunflower under the glow of his porch light, a light bulb that was also technically non-compliant according to HOA rules but now felt like a badge of honor. Ethan Carter was no stranger to conflict. After all, his day job involved presiding over cases where people argued about everything from corporate fraud to who owned the rights to a particularly catchy jingle. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the relentless absurdity of the HOA. If Richard and his band of suburban despots thought they could intimidate him, they were sorely mistaken. Ethan wasn't just going to fight back, he was going to make it a spectacle. The next salvo in the HOA's war on Ethan arrived in the form of a certified letter. It was delivered by a mail carrier who looked genuinely apologetic, as if he knew he was handing over something ridiculous. Ethan opened the envelope and found a detailed list of new infractions. According to Richard, Ethan's backyard fence was non-compliant with community aesthetic standards, his driveway had visible cracks that detract from neighborhood harmony, and this one really made Ethan laugh. His dog, Max, was too large for a property of the size. Apparently, Max's existence violated an HOA regulation about pet proportions relative to square footage. Ethan read the letter twice, then handed it to Max, who sniffed it briefly before chewing on the corner. "Good boy," Ethan said. "You're officially my co-conspirator." The HOA had also attached an invoice demanding $10,000 in fines for these alleged infractions. The audacity was impressive even by HOA standards. Ethan couldn't help but marvel at their creativity. It took a special kind of person to invent rules that sounded like they came straight out of a dystopian novel. Rather than respond immediately, Ethan decided to let them stew for a few days. He spent his time reviewing more legal precedents and drafting responses so airtight they could survive a hurricane. He also began researching the HOA board members themselves, because if there's one thing Ethan knew about people who wield petty power, it's that they almost always have skeletons in their closets. It didn't take long for his research to bear fruit. Richard, as it turned out, had been cited twice by the city for unpermitted construction on his own property, a fact that made Ethan laugh so hard he nearly fell out of his chair. Another board member, Linda, had been caught using HOA funds to pay for her personal landscaping bills, a juicy tidbit that Ethan filed away for later use. When Ethan finally replied to the HOA's letter, he did so with flair. He sent them a formal response on letterhead that read, "Office of Judge Ethan Carter." The letter was polite but devastatingly thorough. He refuted each accusation with legal citations and photographic evidence, then added, "As for your assertion that my dog is too large for my property, I must respectfully disagree. Max is not only within acceptable proportions but also far better behaved than certain members of this association." The HOA didn't take kindly to being outmaneuvered. Within days, Richard showed up at Ethan's house again, this time with two other board members in tow and an air of barely concealed hostility. "Mr. Carter," Richard began in his usual pompous tone, "we've reviewed your response and find it lacking." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Lacking? In what way?" "Well," Richard stammered, clearly unprepared for follow-up questions, "it doesn't address the spirit of our regulations." "The spirit?" Ethan repeated incredulously. "I wasn't aware your regulations had spiritual dimensions." Linda chimed in with an attempt at diplomacy. "We just want what's best for the community." Ethan smiled thinly. "And I want what's best for my property rights." The standoff ended with Richard muttering something about further action and storming off like a villain in a soap opera. Ethan watched them leave and shook his head in disbelief. These people were relentless, but so was he. Over the next few weeks, the battle escalated into full-blown warfare. The HOA began sending notices almost daily, each one more absurd than the last. They claimed Ethan's outdoor lights were too bright, despite being standard fixtures, accused him of hosting unauthorized gatherings, he'd had 2 friends over for dinner, and even suggested his recycling bins were improperly sorted. Spoiler, they weren't. Ethan responded to each notice with increasing levels of sarcasm. "Dear HOA board," he wrote in one reply, "thank you for your concern about my outdoor lighting. I assure you that my porch light is not part of an elaborate scheme to blind passing motorists or disrupt migratory bird patterns." In another letter, regarding your accusation that my recycling bins are improperly sorted, I regret to inform you that I am unable to locate any federal or state laws requiring me to alphabetize my recyclables. Despite his humor, Ethan knew this wasn't just about annoying letters, it was about principle. The HOA was trying to bully him into submission, and he refused to let them win. One evening, as Ethan sat on his porch sipping whiskey and brainstorming his next move, inspiration struck. If the HOA wanted war, he'd give them war, but on his terms. Ethan began compiling every piece of evidence he'd gathered against the HOA, their illegal threats to seize property, their misuse of funds, their hypocritical infractions, Richard's unpermitted construction being a personal favorite. He organized everything into what could only be described as the ultimate dossier. Then he started drafting complaints, not just 1 or 2 but dozens, to file with every relevant agency, state regulators, local government offices, even consumer protection organizations. But Ethan didn't stop there. He decided it was time to rally the troops, or rather, his neighbors. He hosted an informal barbecue and invited everyone from the community except the HOA board members. Over burgers and beers, he shared his findings and explained how the HOA had been abusing its power. To his surprise and delight, many neighbors agreed with him. They'd been dealing with similar nonsense from Richard and his cronies for years but hadn't known how to fight back. By the end of the night, Ethan had assembled an unofficial coalition of disgruntled homeowners ready to challenge the HOA's authority. As Ethan cleaned up after the barbecue, Max trotted over with what appeared to be another HOA notice clamped between his teeth, the latest salvo in their ridiculous crusade. Ethan took it from him and laughed as he read it aloud. "Mr. Carter, your recent gathering violated community noise ordinances." Ethan Carter didn't just prepare for the HOA's next move, he orchestrated it. Like a chess grandmaster anticipating every possible counterplay, Ethan knew the HOA couldn't resist escalating their nonsense. And sure enough, they didn't disappoint. Less than a week after his barbecue, Ethan received an official summons to attend a special HOA hearing where his alleged infractions would be reviewed before the entire community. The letter, signed by Richard in his usual flourish of self-importance, promised a fair and impartial discussion about Ethan's violations. Ethan couldn't help but laugh. Fair and impartial? From Richard? That was like expecting a cat to referee a dog show. The hearing was scheduled for Saturday morning in the community center, a building that looked like it had been designed by someone who hated joy. Ethan arrived early, dressed in his sharpest suit and carrying a leather briefcase that practically screamed, "I know more about the law than you do." He wasn't just here to defend himself, he was here to dismantle the HOA's entire operation. As he walked into the room, he was greeted by rows of folding chairs filled with curious neighbors. Some looked sympathetic, others looked like they were there for the drama. At the front of the room sat Richard and the other board members behind a long table that resembled a mock courtroom. Richard was wearing a blazer that was 2 sizes too big, and Linda sat beside him clutching a clipboard as if it were her lifeline. "Mr. Carter," Richard said, gesturing for Ethan to take his seat at the defendant's table. Yes, they had actually set up a defendant's table. "Thank you for joining us." Ethan smiled politely. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." Richard cleared his throat and began reading from what appeared to be a script. "We are gathered here today to address numerous violations committed by Mr. Carter, including, but not limited to, non-compliant door color, unauthorized flora, excessive noise levels, and improper pet proportions." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Improper pet proportions? You're really sticking with that one?" Richard ignored him and continued reading as if he were delivering the Gettysburg Address. When he finally finished, he turned to Ethan with a smug expression. "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Ethan stood up slowly, letting the tension build like a seasoned performer about to deliver his opening monologue. "I do," he said, his voice calm but authoritative. "But before I begin, I'd like to clarify something. Are we operating under HOA regulations or state law? Because if it's state law, I'll need to remind you that this hearing has no legal standing." Richard blinked rapidly, clearly caught off guard. "We're operating under HOA regulations." "Ah," Ethan said with mock seriousness. "So we're pretending this is legally binding?" A few neighbors chuckled nervously, and Richard's face turned an impressive shade of red. "Mr. Carter," Linda interjected in an attempt to regain control, "this is about community standards." "Community standards?" Ethan repeated. Interesting choice of words coming from an organization that misuses funds and violates state statutes. The room went silent. "What are you talking about?" Richard demanded. Ethan opened his briefcase and pulled out the ultimate dossier. He placed it on the table with a satisfying thud and began flipping through pages as if he were presenting evidence at a high-profile trial. "Let's start with misuse of funds," Ethan said casually. "According to these financial records, which I obtained through public access laws, you've been using HOA money to pay for private landscaping services at your home, Richard." Richard's jaw dropped. "And Linda," Ethan continued without missing a beat, "you've been reimbursed for personal expenses unrelated to HOA activities, including a spa day last month." Linda looked like she might faint. "But wait," Ethan said, holding up a finger dramatically. "There's more. The HOA has been issuing fines that exceed limits established by Colorado Revised Statutes Section 38-33.3-3021K. That means every fine you've issued, including the ones against me, is illegal." The neighbors began murmuring amongst themselves, and Ethan could see several people nodding in agreement. "This is ridiculous." Richard sputtered. "You're twisting things." "Oh," Ethan said innocently. "Am I twisting things when I point out that your threat to seize my property violates state law? Or when I note that your rule about door colors wasn't properly ratified?" Richard looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. Ethan leaned forward slightly, letting his voice drop just enough to sound intimidating. "Here's the thing, I don't mind following reasonable rules. But what I won't tolerate is an organization abusing its power and wasting everyone's time with petty nonsense." The room erupted into applause. Richard tried desperately to regain control of the situation. This isn't about us. It's about you breaking community rules." "Community rules?" Ethan repeated with mock incredulity. "You mean rules like not building unpermitted structures on your property? Because you've done that twice, Richard." More murmurs from the crowd and now some outright laughter. Linda tried again to salvage their dignity. "Mr. Carter, we're just trying to maintain harmony in our neighborhood." "Harmony?" Ethan said with a laugh. "Linda, your idea of harmony involves micromanaging people's trash cans and threatening legal action over sunflowers." By this point, several neighbors were openly laughing or shaking their heads in disbelief. Ethan decided it was time for his grand finale. He turned to address the crowd directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, this isn't just about me, it's about all of us living under an HOA that prioritizes power trips over actual community well-being. If we want real harmony in this neighborhood, maybe it's time we reconsider who's running things." The applause was deafening. Richard looked like he might explode, but there was nothing he could do. The tide had turned against him completely. As Ethan packed up his briefcase and prepared to leave, one neighbor approached him with a smile. "Thank you," she said quietly. "We've been dealing with their nonsense for years." Ethan nodded and smiled back. "Happy to help." As he walked out of the community center into the bright morning sunlight, Max trotted beside him wagging his tail, a perfectly proportioned dog enjoying victory alongside his perfectly proportioned owner. For once in this ridiculous saga, Ethan felt something resembling peace, even if it was temporary. Ethan Carter had done it. He had walked into the lion's den, faced down the HOA board, and emerged victorious. The hearing had been less of a trial and more of a public humiliation for Richard and his cronies. But Ethan wasn't the type to rest on his laurels. No, this was just the beginning of his crusade against suburban tyranny. The fallout from the hearing was immediate and glorious. Word spread quickly throughout the neighborhood that Ethan had taken on the HOA and won. Neighbors who had previously been too afraid to speak up suddenly found their voices. Complaints about Richard's leadership flooded in, everything from his misuse of funds to his habit of enforcing rules selectively. Apparently, Richard's cousin's house had a red door, which was somehow grandfathered in. The HOA board was in chaos, and Ethan couldn't have been happier. But Richard wasn't done yet. Like a villain in a bad soap opera, he refused to accept defeat gracefully. Less than a week after the hearing, Ethan received yet another letter from the HOA. This time, it accused him of fostering dissent among community members and undermining the authority of the board. Ethan laughed so hard he nearly spilled his coffee. Undermining authority? He wasn't undermining anything, he was obliterating it. Ethan decided to respond in kind. He drafted a letter that was equal parts legal rebuttal and comedic masterpiece. "Dear HOA," he began, "thank you for your concern about my alleged fostering of dissent. I assure you that my actions are entirely in line with my constitutional right to free speech, something I'm sure you would have learned about if you'd ever bothered to read past page 1 of your CC and RS. He ended the letter with a suggestion: perhaps instead of accusing me of undermining your authority, you could focus on rebuilding trust within the community. A task that might involve less threatening letters and more transparency about where our dues are actually going. The letter went viral within the neighborhood. Several neighbors printed copies and taped them to their mailboxes as a form of silent protest. Richard was livid, but there was nothing he could do. Ethan had become untouchable. As the weeks went by, Ethan continued to chip away at the HOA's power structure. He filed formal complaints with state regulators about their illegal fines and misuse of funds. He attended every HOA meeting armed with legal documents and an unshakable sense of humor, pointing out every inconsistency in their rules with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. At one particularly memorable meeting, Richard tried to introduce a new rule requiring all homeowners to install matching flower beds in their front yards. Ethan raised his hand and asked innocently, "Does this rule apply to your cousin's house with the red door? Or is she exempt because she's family?" The room erupted into laughter, and Richard looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. But Ethan's greatest triumph came when he rallied enough neighbors to call for a vote to dissolve the current HOA board entirely. It was a bold move, one that required weeks of organizing and countless conversations, but it paid off. On voting day, nearly every homeowner showed up to cast their ballot. The results were decisive. Richard and his cronies were out. The neighborhood celebrated like it had just won independence from an oppressive regime. There were barbecues, block parties, and even a few fireworks, which technically violated city ordinances but felt entirely appropriate given the circumstances. Ethan watched it all unfold from his porch with Max by his side, feeling like he'd just led a revolution. In the aftermath of the vote, Ethan declined multiple requests to join the new HOA board. "I think I've done enough damage for one lifetime," he joked. Instead, he helped draft new bylaws that prioritized fairness and transparency over arbitrary rules about door colors and dog sizes. Life in the neighborhood gradually returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be after such an upheaval. Ethan resumed his quiet routine, working cases during the day, relaxing on his porch in the evenings, and occasionally chuckling at how ridiculous things had gotten. One day, as he was walking Max through the neighborhood, a neighbor stopped him to say thank you. "You've inspired us," she said sincerely. "We were all too scared to stand up before, but you showed us we didn't have to put up with their nonsense." Ethan smiled modestly. "All I did was read some legal documents." "No," she said firmly. "You gave us courage." Ethan nodded thoughtfully as Max wagged his tail beside him. Maybe he hadn't just won a battle against bureaucratic absurdity, maybe he'd actually made a difference. As Ethan returned home that evening, he found one last letter waiting for him in his mailbox, not from Richard or Linda or anyone else on the old board, but from one of his neighbors who had joined the new HOA leadership team. "Dear Mr. Carter," it read, "thank you for everything you've done for this community. We hope you'll consider attending our next meeting. We could use your expertise." Ethan chuckled as he folded up the letter and placed it on his kitchen counter. Expertise? Sure, he had plenty of that, but for now, he was content just being Ethan Carter, homeowner, dog dad, and occasional thorn in bureaucracy's side. And so ended Ethan's saga with the HOA, a tale of petty tyranny defeated by humor, logic, and an unwavering commitment to justice and blue doors. Max barked happily as Ethan poured himself a glass of whiskey and settled onto his porch for another peaceful evening. If there's one lesson to take away from all this madness, it's that no matter how small or ridiculous a fight may seem, sometimes standing up for yourself is worth every ounce of effort. Now if you enjoyed this story, and let's be honest, who wouldn't? Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends who've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare, or just enjoy seeing petty tyrants get what they deserve. Leave a comment below telling us your favorite part and subscribe for more tales of suburban rebellion. Until next time.